10:03. So Paige, are you good to admit folks as okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to what we think will be well, I'm sure will be a great conversation and extremely timely, given all that we're talking about with the economy these days, and the market volatility is on so many people's minds, and we know that that is affecting us personally and the organizations with which we work and volunteer and are so very passionate about. If we haven't met before, my name is Sharon Goodson, and I work at the Leech Tag Foundation here in Encinitas with Paige Milgram Hills, who is my wonderful colleague. And we have a number of nonprofit capacity building offerings that we provide this falls into them. So we do workshops regularly. This is the second of a 3-part workshop series on kind of navigating these challenging times. It's a bit of a downer, I guess, but what we try to do is be responding to the what we're hearing from everybody. And a lot of that feedback comes from our Fundraising Fridays program that we've had now for almost 5 years. And if you don't know about that, Fundraising Fridays is a weekly online Zoom conversation that we had. We started just after COVID began, and it's been going strong. And it's just a great time for people, whether you're a direct fundraiser, a board member, volunteer, et cetera. If you have any questions about fundraising or board governance, nonprofit program development, et cetera, it's a great opportunity to just come informally ask. And we partner with the local Association of Fundraising Professionals, the San Diego chapter, as well as the North County Philanthropy Council. And it's a great also place for us to share upcoming trainings and funding opportunities and network and all that good stuff. So since we began, we have had about 40 to 50 people consistently come. So we've actually been able to serve really thousands of individual folks over these 5 years, and lots have gotten funding ideas. At the last time we checked, which was quite a while ago, the group in total had raised over $4 million, given something that they learned through that. So this is, part of what we hear is that folks need more information. And I got to meet folks from Bernstein Wealth Management while teaching at the USD Nonprofit Symposium a few months ago. And it was just one of those, chance meetings over lunch that I got to meet one of the colleagues there. I'd heard of Bernstein and all the great work that they had done, with many, different partners. And I learned about the educational offerings that are provided. So one thing led to another, connected with Ben Lucas and Chris Clarkson, who are our speakers today, and are so happy for you to join us. Just as a quick backup, we are recording the session, as you probably know, and we will share the recording and the PowerPoint slides that Ben and Chris will be presenting shortly. So if you need anything there, we'll also share our upcoming workshop. We have another one in May, which is around fundraising techniques to use during challenging times. So a little bit about Bernstein. So Bernstein Wealth Management has been serving the community for over 55 years. They are throughout the US, headquartered in Nashville, which I thought was really interesting, but they have a great presence in Southern California with an office here in San Diego, which is where Ben is, and then Chris is in LA. Chris is a national director of the company and has been in the field for nearly 30 years. And I'm not sure, with Bernstein that entire time, I think, yeah.
That's right.
Wow, they got you right out of school. Good for them. And Ben has been in the field more than 10 years, and with Bernstein the past 4.5. So both, Ben is a wealth advisor. So that I will, with this, turn it over to them. The formal part of this program will be probably about an hour or so, and then we'll have time for questions. So you can certainly put questions in the Q&A, in the Q&A part, or in the chat. I'll monitor those, and but we will make sure that we get to them. Okay, I turn it over to you guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sharon and Paige, for setting this up. And good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you all. And Chris and I are glad that you could join us for this morning's session and what we're calling the importance of sizing and investing nonprofit reserves. And what we're going to be doing today is going through one of our cash reserves analyses tools. So Sharon already gave us very kind introductions. As she mentioned, I'm here in San Diego, functioning as an advisor, working with our nonprofit clients on a day-to-day basis. And Chris leads our planning team out of Los Angeles, so he partners with us very closely. And it's actually his team that is responsible for conducting much of the analyses that we'll be discussing this morning. So maybe, Chris, if you don't mind, we could bring up the slides when you get a chance. And before I turn it over to Chris, because he is going to walk us through one of these analyses so you can really see what it looks like, I thought it might be helpful to try and bring to life what a success here looks like by sharing a real life story of a local nonprofit who successfully leveraged one of these cash reserves analyses tools to help their organization grow and really set themselves up to leave a legacy in the community in which we all live and work. So the way this brief story begins is, as so often happens for us at Bernstein, given that we don't do any traditional advertising or marketing, it was a situation where the CEO of the nonprofit was introduced to us through another group that we had done some work for in the community. And the organization came to us with the simple question of, what should we do with our cash? They said, we know we have more than we need, but really have no idea where to begin. We've been getting conflicting advice. How can you help us? And so what we did was Chris and I sat down and spent some time with the CEO and board chair, after which we learned that the organization had actually just received an anonymous gift, the first of its kind for the organization. And this had boosted their cash reserve position from a few $100,000 to a few $1 million. So we quickly understood, at Bernstein, this is a great sign that this is an ideal candidate for the cash reserves analysis tool. And what we did was offered to do a deeper dive with the head of their finance department, who in this case, also happened to be the CEO, not uncommon with the developing nonprofit, but really to get a sense of the organization's needs, desires, and talk through a number of other items that Chris will get into shortly. Fast forward about a week or so later, Chris and his team at this point have had a chance to roll up their sleeves, work on the analysis. We went back, shared our findings with the CEO, and she was thrilled to learn that we thought that based on their needs, they actually had enough to start building out a small endowment, in addition to learning how to more effectively allocate their short-term funds to higher income producing investments. So at this point, as is often the case, she said, look, this all sounds great to me. I'd love to move forward, but we're going to need to get the board on board, and I'd love your help doing that. Well, we welcomed those conversations, as we told her, and what happened was, join the next board meeting, spent about 15 to 20 minutes talking through our findings and answering questions from the board, who ultimately voted to move forward in helping or allowing us to help them allocate these funds. I'd also add that as part of that experience, this included helping the board fulfill their fiduciary duty by really memorializing and institutionalizing within the organization the work that we'd done by, again, working with Chris's team, this time to put together an investment policy statement in addition to a gift acceptance policy, ensuring that the next time a gift occurred, they would be ready to act. Well, that was back in the beginning of 2024. And lo and behold, just before these last winter holidays at the end of 2024, they received another gift, this time, again, doubling the size of their account. So given all of the work that had been done up front, we were fortunately in a position to get these dollars working on behalf of the organization immediately. And the leaders of the group remarked just how simple this was the second time around. So I just tell this story to hopefully bring to life, again, what the cash reserves analysis tool is capable of doing and how it's really most effective for those organizations who are motivated to grow and really looking to set themselves up for success when those dollars start to inevitably flow through the door if they aren't already there. Now, with that real life example in mind, I'll call attention to a few key points on the slide that's in front of you all right now, just to give you a sense again of really who is giving you this advice that's about to follow from Chris. So this slide aims to give you a sense of Bernstein's presence both locally and throughout the country to show you the type of organizations that, again, are potentially a good fit for the cash reserves analysis tool. And just as far as who we work with, going back, as Sharon mentioned, we've been doing this for about 5.5+ decades now, working with nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. But about a decade ago, Bernstein made a real concerted effort to do some research into our own nonprofit client base to really figure out both how best to serve those clients and frankly also how to grow our business in the space. And what we found probably won't surprise many of you on this call, and it's the fact that for the largest nonprofit institutions globally, there really are no lack of resources, right? Either internal teams that they've developed themselves or external partners. Every investment firm and other firm in the world has arms open wide, ready to sort of take in dollars, give resources in exchange for that. But at the same time, what was interesting is that we found that the group that we'll call the developing nonprofit, so think the organization with maybe 3, 4, 5, up to $100 million in assets, was really being underserved. And that there was a real opportunity to come in and help these organizations grow and succeed if they receive the right support. So we saw this as a real opportunity to come in and not only invest assets on their behalf, but really to be more of a holistic financial partner where we conduct research in the space, share best practices between clients where it makes sense, right? If there's an organization in New York that just had a successful capital campaign and we have a similar client here in Southern California, well, why not, connect them, share best practices, things of that sort, to helping with policy and governance, as I just mentioned, operational support, even helping grow and support donor development efforts. Really a natural fit given that Bernstein also serves higher net worth private clients as well. And then you see here on the slide a number of organizations, both locally again and throughout the country, that have taken us up on that offer for partnership. Now, Chris, if you don't mind going to the next slide. You see here just the agenda, what we'll do for the remainder of the session, starting with a brief bit of information on the economy and markets, sort of where we are today and how that can impact nonprofit decision-making. After that, turn things over to Chris to take us through one of the reserves analyses, some real-world examples, before touching on how to actually invest and how an organization should document decisions made throughout that process. Now, we will have, as Sharon mentioned, a formal question and answer period at the end, but do please feel free to jump in with any thoughts or questions throughout, as interactive sessions are always preferred, even though that could sometimes be a bit difficult on Zoom. So don't hesitate to do that as well. Chris, if we could go next slide. From a market perspective, and we can dive into this in as much detail as folks want later, I would just say that really for anyone who's even glanced at the news as of late knows, right, there's just a handful of things going on keeping us very busy, but which have resulted in significant uncertainty and market volatility. Of course, the primary driver of that has been changes in political governmental policy, specifically tariff policy, which, as you may have noticed, have reduced post-election stock market gains to just about the spot they were more or less 12 months ago today, and leading markets to be down about 10% year to date. So this does put the markets in a fairly precarious position going forward, just given the impact that Federal Reserve actions have on markets and the bind that the Federal Reserve is currently in regarding whether to hold interest rates steady, raise, or lower them as we go forward. And the reason that's a challenge is because they have to balance their dual mandate of both price stability and keeping inflation in check, while also ensuring labor market strength. So as I mentioned, happy to answer questions there, go into detail later. But key point here is that we know there are real risks to nonprofit organizations, both in your day-to-day functions and also in your portfolios, and that really it's more important than ever to put into place a diversified all-weather strategy to safeguard the organization through times like this, ensuring success no matter what the market throws at us. And we've seen the benefits of diversification thus far this year as US markets have been volatile, as I mentioned. Some other asset classes and other geographies around the world have actually held up fairly resiliently. Chris, one more slide, please. Now, I know I've spent a bit of time talking about organizations in cash, that they should get out of cash if it suits their organization. But really, why is that important, right? And I think this slide does a phenomenal job of telling that story. And so I'll take a moment to explain the bar chart that you see here. And what you're looking at are annual returns for the calendar year 2023. So as we move across from left to right, you see in blue returns for a cash portfolio, in yellow returns for a conservative portfolio, in purple returns for a moderate, what we'll call 60 stock-like, 40 bond-like assets, and then in red or maroon, a more aggressive portfolio. And what you'll notice is that cash had a return in 2023 of 5.3%. Seems like a fairly nice return, one that many would be happy with, until, again, you glance across the screen and realize that even an allocation to a moderate, call it 60-40 type of portfolio, would have more than doubled the return given to the organization in the form of a 12.3% calendar year return. So I think this does a nice job of illustrating the real opportunity cost of sitting in cash when you don't need to, and shows why it's so important that nonprofits match investment strategy with time horizon, as Chris will get into shortly. So appreciate everyone's attention thus far. Chris, I will turn it over to you to walk through the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And maybe even before I turn to the next slide, when I look at that graph on the left, the difference between the blue and the yellow or the purple bars, how I interpret that is, boy, that additional income interest is enough to hire another person, to pay a salary for a year, to develop and grow and enhance a program that's so important to your mission, right? Every single dollar counts in the good work that gets done. Okay, so let's talk about our approach to addressing this issue. Now, I started, I suppose, this slide with the positive, right? The organizations that we've worked with who have a good problem on their hands, which is more cash on their balance sheet than they're likely to need in their upcoming operating budget cycle. And that can happen for a number of reasons. It can be accumulated over time. Perhaps there was a sale of an asset, a building, maybe a transformational gift was received or a bequest from a donor. We've had the good fortune of working with a number of organizations who received a gift from Mackenzie Scott, a yield gift, that really changed the fortune of the organization moving forward. Now, as great as that problem is, we will also talk a little bit about the flip side of things, which are organizations that have run into a much more challenging revenue picture. Perhaps they had been the recipients of government funding, which is getting halted, and all of a sudden that they're wondering, do we have enough cash on the balance sheet to be able to conduct our operations appropriately? The issue there is that there are a couple of concerns, with in a way having too much cash, right? One is that, well, interest rates are much higher than they were 5 years ago when rates were at rock bottom. So you want to make sure that the cash you do have is working hard enough. And the second is, holding cash can come with a cost when it comes to thinking about how cash behaves versus inflation. All right, so let's talk about each of these two concerns in a little more detail. Okay, on the top half of this page, showing money market interest rates going back to 2022, when I mentioned, boy, it wasn't that long ago, the early part of that year when cash basically was paying bupkis, and that changed in a big way as the Fed raised rates rapidly through 2002 and into 2023. For a while there, cash equivalent rates earning north of 5%. Now, this was a chart that I made last fall. It goes through November 30th. So 4.5% is a little higher than cash equivalents, money market CDs, those kinds of things are earning today. It's probably a closer to 4%, a little north of 4% today. However, if you look at, according to the FDIC, the average rate paid on basic savings accounts at banks, my gosh, less than 0.5%. And so here's my first takeaway today is just to make sure that the funds that you are holding in cash, make sure that you're earning a an interest rate that's competitive in today's market, right? You might find that you have a savings account or some sort of yielding instrument that's down in the 2 to 3% today, and frankly that's really not enough. You can do better. So make sure you're up in that 4% range. That said, though, there are periods when cash does not perform well against inflation, and we don't have to look too far in the rearview mirror to find a period like that. We all recall back coming out of the pandemic in 2021 and 2022, when inflation for those calendar years ran at 7 and 6.5% for the full year periods. Boy, it got even higher than that for short periods of time. And again, back then, cash producing very little. So if you were parked on the sidelines in cash, back in 2021, boy, you lost about 7% of the purchasing power of those assets. In 2022, almost 5% of the purchasing power. So sometimes what feels like the safest way to hold your money can come with a cost, and it's that cost of losing out to inflation. So we think organizations need a thoughtful framework to determine what is the right amount to hold in cash specifically or in reserves a bit more broadly. So let's talk a little bit about how we tend to approach this issue. First, we think most every organization needs a rainy day fund of operating reserves that can cover a potential rough patch, a shortfall of revenues versus expenses, right? We run into unanticipated challenges or extraordinary expenses, or frankly, just maintaining financial security over the long run. It's good to have an operating reserve to get you through times in many cases like these. Now, some organizations might also be aware of a specific program, a capital improvement, something that's coming up, some spending need that's likely above their regular operating budget. And they may well have assets that have already been received and can be earmarked against that new program, that new project. Here, our objective really is to try to match the time horizon of the investment strategy with the time horizon of that spending need, right? If 3 years from now, you're going to have to put a new roof on a building and you have those funds today, well, maybe they shouldn't just stay in the checking account for the next 3 years. If we can get those funds to be working, just a little bit harder. Now, when it comes to how much to keep in that rainy day fund of operating reserves, a lot of organizations might look to a rule of thumb. I should keep a certain number of days of cash on hand or months, maybe 3 or 6 months of expenses. But we think we should go a little deeper than that and create a customized recommendation that's based on the specific financial circumstances of the organization and really the likelihood that you might run into a deficit, a shortfall of your revenues versus expenses. And so the way that we go about doing that is really starting with a conversation and collecting some information, gathering details about what has been the historical experience of the organization. What were things like during the pandemic? Understanding a bit of the balance sheet and the income statement. So whether it's revenues or assets, what kind of restrictions might surround some of those income streams or assets, and how flexible you can be in utilizing some of those revenues or assets to cover general operating expenses, or is there part of the resources of the organization restricted to a very narrow subset of the work that you do. Gathering up some information about revenues, expenses, again, reserves for specific projects. By the way, we have a a questionnaire, a 3-page questionnaire that we use to gather up that information, or at a minimum to guide the conversation as we're trying to learn more about the organization. We'll circle back at the end, but we're happy to provide that as well, so you can get a sense for the kinds of things we look at and questions that we ask. Now, we evaluate the risk of the organization based on 4 different factors, if you will, that I'm showing here. But let's talk about each in a little bit of detail. First, revenues. So, one of the things we want to understand is how predictable and reliable have the revenue streams been? Have they been susceptible to disruption? Again, be it the pandemic, or because of a change in government administration. And we also like to understand how diversified have the revenue streams been, or are they particularly concentrated? Well, the more uncertainty surrounding the revenues, the more concentration, well, then probably the more reserves that should be kept on hand to deal with a potential shortfall. We like to understand about spending. Here, the idea is, boy, how flexible can the organization be? Can you adapt to a changing revenue picture? Or are there a lot of fixed expenses, rent and debt payments, multi-year commitments? We also, based on the mission of the organization, want to understand a little bit about, gosh, in a changing economic environment, for example, could there be a significant spike in the demand for the services that you provide, that you might like to step up and meet if possible, even if that meant running at a bit of a deficit and tapping into reserves? Again, the less flexibility the organization might have around their budget, the more that should be kept in reserves. We also try to understand timing of the cash flows. Sometimes the amount that's coming in the door and the amount that's going out the door during the course of the year, well, those are perfectly matched, but boy, the timing of receipts and disbursements is not at all. Sometimes there's a major fundraiser or gala or a conference that brings in significant revenue. Some organizations, find they bring in a lot in December in year-end giving. Maybe there are a number of foundation funders out there that provide a grant once or twice a year. Receipts come in, but there are bills to pay all year long. Well, the greater the mismatch in the timing, the greater the seasonality of the inflows versus the outflows, well, the more that you should have on hand, especially so that, boy, if there's a delay in any of when those revenues are expected to be received, that you're still able to support operations through that period. Lastly, what I've called borrowing risk. I'm not so sure that's the greatest term anymore. I think what I would call this really is access to credit. Is there any sort of a letter of credit or other borrowing facility in place? Even if it's not the first place that you might turn should you run into a difficult period, just knowing that that's there, that safety valve, we again do factor that into the analysis. We not necessarily a dollar for dollar offset for reserves, but we do incorporate it. Now, I will say that while when we gather up this information, we are thinking about the history of operations. Really, we also want to be thinking about this on a forward-looking basis, right? And there might be some organizations whose situations have just changed. Again, if there are government funds that you have been relying upon that all of a sudden are at risk, or if there's already clarity that those might cease, well, that's going to paint a very different picture than maybe what things have looked like historically. So we really do want to be looking at what does the future likely hold when it comes to these sorts of risks. Now, this page is actually One of the output pages where those dials on the right do get customized to the specifics of each organization in part of our proprietary analysis. Looks like maybe Alex has to drop. No problem. With Bernstein's cash reserves analysis, we translate those risks and inputs into recommendations for, well, how much should be kept in that rainy day fund of operating reserves? Are there specific programs or needs in the short run that we want to reserve for, and again, match the time horizon of the next few years, maybe even a longer or intermediate term? And once we funded those, well, that might free up assets to be working harder in a longer term board designated quasi endowment that can form a bit of a perpetual machine of operating support to help the budget each and every year. Now, let me show you just a couple of high level examples. So I've sort of tabbed a low risk, a medium risk, and a high risk type organization. And part of this is meant to give you a little bit of a gauge so you can decide, hey, where do we fit on this overall spectrum? So let me start on the left, the lower risk organization. This one was a professional college. It was very well renowned in its field, had a steady and growing enrollment, a solid alumni base that formed a good donor pool. Interestingly, they were running into a little bit of a difference of opinion on their board. They had accumulated a very substantial amount of cash reserves. The management of the college, the officers were looking to tap into a bit of those reserves to assist financially with scholarships and other benefits for the student body, but the board was a little bit reluctant to spend from those reserves in the near term. So we conducted the reserves analysis, and look, what we found, again, with the thriving donor base, their revenues were largely predictable, and in fact, they did have a few quite successful alumni who might even be willing to lend some money to the organization, God forbid, if that were necessary. The expense picture was a little bit difficult to change on a week-to-week basis, but basically from school year to school year, it could be adjusted pretty significantly. All told, a pretty low risk organization here. We typically would recommend somewhere between 3 and 12 months of expenses be housed in an operating reserve rainy day fund type of account. This one really came in about that floor of 3 months worth of expenses. But the good news there is that freed up some funds to be able to provide some of that tuition assistance and scholarship support that the administrators of the college were looking for, and gave them some comfort and some confidence that they were still in a very, very strong, well-reserved financial position. How about the middle column there, our medium risk organization? So this was a professional association that was typically provides a major conference networking and education type modules. And they ran into some trouble during the pandemic, where all of a sudden their in-person gatherings were threatened. They were able to convert to more of a virtual model, both for their conference and their education, as many organizations were forced to adapt at that time. But it did come to light that, boy, if there's a delay or the absence of that big in-person conference, that that there could be some financial issues for them. There was sort of a national affiliate organization that they could borrow. When we factored that all in, there were some issues, mostly the significant mismatch of the timing of those inflows, where there were often expenses incurred leading up to the conference, and revenues very much surrounding that once a year event with bills to pay all year long. So that they did need a little bit more than that 3-month floor. And we had calculated about a 5-month expense operating reserve was appropriate. But lastly, on the right, the higher risk organization. So this was an animal related organization that had a fairly high fixed cost to own and maintain a facility. In fact, they had purchased another property not that long ago, and so did have some sizable debt payments as well. Also found that a pretty high portion of their revenues were tied to 2 major foundation funders. So there was some risk, even though the relationships were good and positive, that God forbid, if there was a change among one of those funders, that would create a bit of a hole in their revenue budget. And so, here there were some more concerns, some more red lights flashing, and a higher operating reserve was going to be appropriate, given really the lack of any flexibility and some major fixed and longer term commitments for them. We had suggested about 8.5 months was appropriate for them. So let me pause here. Ben, I will say one thing. I have a little trouble reading the chat bubbles as they pop by. I wonder, are there any questions that have come up on what we've discussed thus far? Or maybe I'll open it up to all of the participants as well. Any questions that we can address before we move a little bit to the how we build and invest for these reserve pools?
Doesn't look like we don't have questions that have been entered in the Q&A or chat, but certainly anybody who has one could come off mute.
Well, thank you, Sharon. No problem, but a question?
Just ask, when you've determined the amount of time, 8.5 months or 3 to 12 months, where then do you recommend putting those funds? What type of investments while they're being held in advance?
It's as if you are teeing up the next couple of slides in the presentation. So, if you'll bear with me, that's exactly where we're going to go next. Is how do we think about investing these reserves, be it for an operating reserve or any of the other needs? So, in the next few minutes, I will address that question. Why don't we get right to it? And again, we'll check in periodically if other questions come up. Again, no need to necessarily hold them right to the end. We'd like to make sure that we're getting everyone's questions addressed. So let's talk about, how should reserves be held or invested? I think one sort of misnomer that's often out there, we often talk about, well, how much should an organization hold in cash? But cash doesn't necessarily need to mean cash. And by that, I certainly don't mean, paper bills that are held under the mattress. But let's say, in the bank, pure sort of cash equivalent type investments, bank checking, savings, CDs, money markets, those kinds of things. What we really try to do is to identify as best as we can if there is a specific amount and timing that we know when funds might need to be dispersed, accessed, or spent. And we sort of try to divide up among the bullets on the bottom of this slide. Now, those funds that are almost certain to be spent within the next 6 months, and look, organizations that are conservative, I can extend that out to even 12. Those I would keep in cash equivalents. I would not want to take any risk with these kinds of funds. You'd want something safe and stable. Those funds, though, that aren't likely to be needed, even if it's very confident that we won't need them within the next 6 months, well, we might start to reach just a little bit for more yield, higher interest, more return. Certainly for those funds that aren't going to be needed within the next or until the next 1 to 3 years, then we might look to a more short duration, but still very liquid, very conservative bond solution. And as we start getting out there, 3 to 5 years, we might approach a little bit differently. More than 5 years, I would think of this as the opportunity for a longer term investment strategy. Let me talk about these in a little bit of detail. And by the way, I'm going to share with you specifically how Bernstein implements and invests within each of these timeframes. Let me be very clear. This is not about trying to sell you investments, much more about conceptually how we think. And I know that there'll be many organizations that work with a community foundation or another investment provider, and that's great. This is more about, hey, how might we think about from an asset allocation perspective, investing for each of these timeframes. That said, I'm going to talk about how we do it. What is our best thinking? So let me start on the top of this page. And again, for those funds that are very likely to be spent or accessed within the next 6 months, again, zero risk there. We deliver that cash equivalent in a government money market fund. Again, by the way, we will be sending out all of these slides so you can get them all afterwards. So don't feel like you got to write everything down. The government money market fund is one that invests in U.S. government securities and Federal Reserve deposits. So not taking any sort of credit risk there. Again, it's daily liquidity. So you're not suffering any sort of penalties or tying your money up for a longer period of time. Today, still getting paid for that, about 4.1%. That said, that rate is tied very closely to what the Federal Reserve is set in the Fed rate. So we could very well get to a point this summer or fall where if the economy slows down and the Fed decides to cut interest rates, well, that 4.1% is going to very quickly track that floating Fed funds rate. How about for funds that you probably aren't going to need within the next 6 months? Funds that, but you might well need within 12. So that middle column, what we call enhanced cash. Here we deliver in a ultra short duration bond portfolio. So this is a very high credit quality, but more broadly diversified, actively managed bond portfolio, but one that's housed inside of an exchange traded fund, an ETF, right? Which is very much like a mutual fund, but that trades throughout the day in the market. So this again is a daily liquid vehicle. Now there's something going on a little interesting with interest rates right now, and that's that normally if you invest with a little bit longer maturity point of view on your instruments, so this is a fund that has a duration average maturity, if you will, of about 9.1 months. Normally you get paid a little bit more in interest and yield for doing that. Today, that isn't quite true. There's a little bit of a smile at the very shortest end of the yield curve. And so, the short duration bond fund today paying just shy of 4%, 3.97 versus the money market at 4.1. And so that, in some ways there's the thought, well, gosh, why move out of money market funds into something that's a slightly longer duration? And really the reason, well, if we are extending those securities and the Fed does cut interest rates, you do get that yield for a little bit longer until those holdings within the fund mature. And with bonds, typically when interest rates fall, if the Fed does decide to cut, bond prices rise. So there is a little bit of opportunity for appreciation in very, very short duration bond instruments versus in pure cash money market equivalents. And so our best thinking, our best estimate is that, gosh, if we were to fast forward 12 months and look in the rearview mirror, you'll actually earn a little bit higher rate of return in that middle sort of enhanced cash, very short duration bond universe than you will in pure money markets and cash equivalents. As we move a little bit further out in the time horizon scale on that bottom row, funds that are needed in the 1 to 3 year time frame, well, there we might look to a blend of that enhanced cash ultra short duration and another short duration income fund that Bernstein manages. What does that do? Well, again, all of these are yielding about the same today, but extends that duration to a little over a year, a little more opportunity for extending that higher yield and earning some appreciation if rates fall. But by the way, for timeframes that are a little bit longer, a 3 to 5 year time frame, now we would actually look to a very conservative balance of stocks and bonds. On the top row, the intermediate time frame, a mix of about 30% in global stocks, 70% in intermediate duration bonds. Now, all these instruments are fully liquid, could get your money back within a couple of days, but you are taking on a little more risk that there could be short-term fluctuation. So if it's very likely that you might need to tap into these funds, that's probably not appropriate for your at least not the whole of your standard operating reserve fund. But if there are funds you're probably not going to touch until 3 to 5 years from now, we think this is a very prudent way to position those funds. And then lastly, the longer term, if the board is able to designate funds that can be invested for a longer horizon, again, whether it's a restricted endowment or just long-term reserves that really are unrestricted and the organization could tap into anytime that they want to, but they've decided to invest for the long term to increase the sustainability of the organization over a long period of time, maybe spending at a prudent rate, 4 to 5% each and every year in hopes of generating a return that's going to match that and grow the portfolio for the long run. We might look to sort of the mirror image there. Now a more growth-oriented 70% in global stocks, 30% bond type of portfolio. So let me get back now to that question. Well, gosh, let's say it's 3, 6, or 8.5 months of operating reserves. That how should they be invested? Well, that answer can depend a little bit. Some organizations, particularly those that are likely to draw down and replenish those reserves during the course of the year, well, you're probably not going to want to take a lot of risk with those. Probably cash equivalents like a money market would be the best place for those funds. Our sort of default recommendation for conservative organizations that don't want to take very much risk, but it's possible we get to the end of the year and we really haven't had to touch our rainy day fund of operating reserves. We'd probably look to that middle row there, something that's a little more than just cash equivalents, but a very, very short duration bond type portfolio. With others, they tend to set up something that's maybe a blend of these different types of strategies, sort of layers of protection, right? Thinking about, well, gosh, if we run into a tough year, what really do we think we might tap into in 6 or 12 months? And maybe that's kept in the cash or enhanced cash. And maybe our operating reserves we have a little bit more, but it's pretty unlikely we're going to have to get into it in one single year. Maybe that last layer, those last dollars that you touch, maybe we do take a balanced approach with stocks and bonds. So if we need to spend through those last dollars could be invested to take a little more risk, but the first dollars would not be. Okay. Before I move on, let me just pause. First, make sure, did that answer the question that was asked out loud? And are there any others that I can address about how we position assets?
I have a question, and it's like actually asking you to take a step back for a moment. So operating reserves is one thing, the rainy day fund. What I'm curious to know is, what are your recommendations around an operating account versus how much cash should you have on hand for your normal monthly expenses?
Yeah, great question, Dana. In addition to everything that I've discussed, you are right that you really need working capital that's in the checking account that can meet the payroll each month, et cetera. Look, I generally like to see at least 30 days at a bare minimum, probably 30 to 60 days worth of expenses that are held in your bank account. Now, look, whether that's in checking, if the bank offers some sort of a potentially yield savings account or something that's sweep or something that's producing some more competitive market rate, hopefully you can maybe do a little bit of maneuvering and keep the funds at least earning interest as much as possible during that period. But yeah, I would very much like to keep 30 to 60 days just pure cash on hand. If your organization is one that, well, we do get funds in, maybe we get tuition in the fall, and that has to last us. Again, I would keep those funds invested safely in cash equivalents, be it money markets or something that is not going to be subjected to a significant risk of loss, whether that stays at your bank, whether it goes to another investment firm and is in a money market fund or some other equivalent. So it's thinking about, some organizations have a very lumpy stream of cash flows and they get money in that they're going to spend down during the course of the year. So sometimes there's a little bit of gray area in between some of these categories, if you will. But my answer to your question is 30 to 60 days. Okay.
And Bob and Marie, did that answer your question, Bob, that you asked earlier?
If I could just go one step further and say that, or ask the question that if the operating funds are essentially as just described, but if there is an additional reserve, a board reserve, what should that reserve be allocated to take care of? And, for example, when we did it in one of the organizations, it was taking the worst possible example we'd ever had in a 10-year period and multiplied it by 4 and ended up with a couple of $1 million in a reserve, a board reserve, but it wasn't an operating reserve. It was in addition to the operating reserve. And so it was meant for a disaster, but what do you do with it if there's no disaster? It wasn't endowment. It could be.
And I suppose that probably depends on the comfort level with living through some fluctuation in the value of that, in your example, $2 million worth of reserves. I definitely think that money could be working harder for your organization than just staying in pure cash equivalents, right? But let's say if the board said, we want this money to be working much, much harder, and even though we know that we can tap into it and take every penny of these funds, we would very much like to invest it for the long run and to be growing it for future spending. That there are plenty of organizations that might choose to invest it in that very long horizon type of strategy. Now, the downside there, of course, is, boy, when you run into, we've been feeling this environment over the last couple of months, or there was, in COVID, when stock market fell by over 30%, God forbid in 2008, I mean, you could easily have environments where that long-term endowment falls by a third of its value, and all of a sudden, your $2 million portfolio, on a temporary basis has become $1.4 million. Hopefully that's not the time when you need to all of a sudden tap into those funds and use them. If the board decides, we can't take that chance, we can't take that kind of risk, well, then you probably invest more conservatively, right? Maybe it's something like that intermediate point of view where it is a more conservatively positioned portfolio of stocks and bonds. It's still going to have some fluctuation, but probably more likely to, see bounces that are maybe in the teens instead of a third of its value. And then, I think that the idea is, if there's a good chance that, in 3 years, we're looking back and we haven't touched that $2 million at all, if that's probably what's going to happen, then again, I would want those funds to be working a little bit harder, and at least in that sort of intermediate frame. If the board just says, no, we just don't want to subject these assets to any sort of real fluctuation, well, then, it could stay in something that's cash and bonds. Maybe we think about a balance of very short term, maybe some intermediate duration bonds to try to boost that return over time. But look, if you've already got the operating reserve, that's sort of the first place we'd turn in a rough patch. I'd really like to see those funds working harder and see something that's some balance of stocks and bonds that the board, and maybe gets a chance to pre-experience a little bit what would be, kind of the worst case loss, and could we live with that on a temporary basis, and develop an asset allocation that's going to let the board sleep at night and be good stewards of the funds.
Thanks, Chris. And Bob, one thing I would add to that, and Chris just alluded to it there at the end, we're not spending any time talking about this really today, but one thing that we often do with boards is actually help model out and pre-experience what future markets might look like based on the variety of options that they have on this menu of risk tolerance, right? So that they can feel, here's the trade-off of sitting in that really conservative account versus, taking on a little bit more risk to get the higher return. Oftentimes boards will look at that, talk amongst themselves, and even use that to document the decision that they eventually end up making.
Good, thank you.
I said I was going to discuss one other topic, and now I sort of skipped right through, but let me address, what about an organization that, let's say, has chosen to invest in a longer term type portfolio, and all of a sudden, boy, things seem to be changing very significantly with their revenue budget. Been working with an organization out of Washington, D.C. that relies on federal funding for a pretty significant portion of its revenue budget, and that revenue is now at risk. And so they're trying to decide, well, gosh, has the time horizon of our reserve investments changed? Should we be taking some of that longer term endowment portfolio and shifting it back into, let's say cash or money markets, because we're going to now run into a very sizable budget deficit this year? If there is some clarity or a very high likelihood, the answer is probably yes. That probably does warrant a change in the way assets are positioned if funds that we thought were going to be invested for the long term are very likely to be needed in the short run. Now, here's the real problem in the scenario that they're facing is, if in fact that government funding does go away permanently, it's going to be almost impossible for them to just continue operating at the exact same expense budget year after year after year moving forward if their revenue has declined significantly. They face some tough choices. that there is going to need to be some strategic conversation about, okay, they can try to diversify their revenue streams, maybe locate some other sources, maybe they can raise, a portion and replace a portion of that revenue that has been lost. But there's going to have to be some balancing, some right sizing of the operational budget down to a level that's going to be sustainable for the long run. Really, the strategic question for them is, how much are we willing to withdraw from our longer term reserves, and for how many years? And really, once that decision has been made, so that they might be able to give themselves a little bit of an off ramp to reposition some of their operating budget over the next few years. Well, again, funds that all of a sudden now are going to be spent in 2025, 2026, instead of staying invested for the long run, well, perhaps those should be repositioned. Often not an easy answer, not an easy conversation, but from a positioning of reserves, an important one that some organizations are being forced to have. Last piece of the puzzle that I wanted to address is the importance of documenting all of the decisions around reserves in an investment policy statement or a reserves policy statement. And what are those and why are they so important? On the left, these are the documents that capture the decisions that have been made and the why, the rationale behind them. That's really important because it provides what we call the institutional memory, right? Let's face it, volunteer boards, that they tend to turn over. And as new members join, they're apt to question, oh my gosh, the markets are going down. Shouldn't we be making a change? It's awfully helpful to have a document that supports the decisions around how the investment program has been structured, that it's, if there is a long-term pool, why it was created, how it's to be invested, and contemplating that there are going to be some challenging environments that come. It's good for onboarding, and most importantly, it's great when the markets become difficult to look back on and answer to different constituents who might be asking, gosh, why is the reserve portfolio of the organization down? And you can talk about the decisions that have been made and show them the investment policy statement. I'd say that there are also benefits to any of you who serve on investment committees or boards as individuals. It's evidence that you're meeting your fiduciary duty. Interestingly, you're judged more on the process that you're following than you are on the actual investment results themselves, right? Sometimes, markets are going to fall or investments won't work out exactly as they were supposed to. That's okay if you're showing that you followed a rational process, considered the factors that you need to as a fiduciary, and an investment policy statement is a great CYA document to have. In the middle there shows some of the various components and contents that probably should be included. And on the right, I'll say this is not a just set it and forget it once kind of document. Really should be looked at each and every year. Now, should it be changed every year? Probably not. That's probably too much, but I'd say, every 3 to 5 years, or if there is a big change in the finances of the organization, that might warrant a change at some point along the way. But, markets evolve, the situation evolves at the nonprofit. So probably every 3 to 5 years is a good time frame to refresh. And so, look, if it's been a long time since you've seen or dusted off your investment policy statement, probably worth giving a second look. We're always happy to provide a second set of eyes if that would be helpful. But by the way, the investment policy statement, really just one step in the fiduciary roadmap that boards and investment committees should be following. I've sort of laid it out in this pyramid from top to bottom. Starts with, as we've talked about, right sizing and defining the different pools of capital and reserves. Be it the operating cash in the bank, the operating reserve rainy day fund, shorter term reserves set up to meet needs that are expected in the next few years, or the intermediate or longer horizon funds. Then setting the specific investment strategy within them, optimizing what's available in the capital markets. For longer term funds, agreeing on a spending policy that the investments can likely support over time. And then look, lastly at the bottom, codifying how these decisions have been made in an investment policy statement, and using that to educate new members of the investment committee or the board as to the rationale behind those investment decisions. I wanted this slide in there for you as a reference, as well as this next one, which can just serve as a reminder that, you know, some of this, you want to set up this fiduciary calendar each year, where if you're meeting with your banker, investment provider, community foundation, whoever it is that's housing the investments, I find that if you put things on the calendar for the course of the year, they get done. Whereas if you don't, it often slips everybody's mind. So things like the investment policy statement, put that as an agenda item on the first quarter meeting that the finance committee is going to review, recommend any potential changes, and re-ratify it each year. Maybe providing a topic of ongoing education, be it on investing in the capital markets, donor engagement, re-energizing the board and utilizing your network, whatever it might be, important to set that calendar. Look, I summarized our approach here, but I think we've talked our way through it, but this could be a good slide to look back on if you want to. And then lastly, I will just make the offer that if there are any organizations, any participants on the call that say, hey, this is great, and Bernstein, would you mind giving us your thoughts on how much we should be holding in reserves based on our situation? We're happy to do that analysis. We don't charge for that. And so if it's of interest, you can email Ben. We've put his email, ben.lucas@bernstein.com, to first get the questionnaire that you can fill out of the information that we need, and then we'll prepare an analysis and sit down and review those results. So certainly no obligation there, but we're happy to provide that service if it could be helpful to anybody that's on the call. Ben, anything you wanted to add before we take more questions?
No, that's great, Chris. I really appreciate it. I see a few questions coming into the chat, so maybe you could just jump ahead and start to answer those. Cheryl, I see your question. What are the general standard fees for an investment company charged to invest a portfolio for a nonprofit? So I would say this is really a function of two things, right? How many assets are being invested, what the dollar amount is, and then what they're being invested in. But on average, it should fall between probably 0.4 and 0.8% per year. And that would be a percentage of the fees of assets under management, because you want to make sure you're being charged that way so that the institution investing on your behalf has their interests aligned with yours. Let's see what else we have. All right, Chris, maybe I'll pose this one to you. A question from Laura. This is all great info. Thank you. Would you amend anything you've presented if the nonprofit is smaller, for example, 500,000 instead of 3 to 5 million that we'd mentioned earlier?
I mean, look, the approach is the same. The startup nonprofits, maybe, that they often, as you're building up your donor-based revenue streams and operations, might not have some of the same consistency of revenues, the same diversification of revenues. So I tend to find a lot of them just haven't reached that point where you're going to be branching beyond the cash equivalents that can be your rainy day fund, that you might have a little more need to tap into them. But really the thought process, the framework is no different. So, again, even the smaller profits, we sometimes find, wow, out of the blue becomes a wonderful gift. A donor leaves a bequest in their will. You do get a Mackenzie Scott gift, something like that. maybe that then affords the opportunity to start to create some of these different buckets. But really nothing wrong, with keeping funds in cash equivalents as you are continuing to build them. But if you find you're getting to that point where we've got a whole lot more than, let's say, 6 months worth of our expenses in the bank, and maybe we should look at trying to have some of these work a little harder, the thought process is the same.
Thanks, Chris. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, great. Chris, question from Jim. In a down market, would you look at a more aggressive approach for something with a 3 to 5 year horizon?
Well, that's interesting, right? So again, probably depends on the comfort level of the board and their willingness to perhaps be more opportunistic, to take advantage of shifting into an asset allocation during a time when assets are certainly depressed from where they were a couple of months ago. Of course, what we don't know is, are assets elevated compared to where they might be 3 or 6 months from now, right? We never quite know where the bottom is. So I think the board has to be comfortable that there might be additional fluctuation in their asset allocation if they go to a more aggressive asset allocation. Again, I still think, in that 3 to 5 year time frame, the chances that you're going to make money over 3 to 5 years in that conservative balance of 30 stocks, 70% bonds are very, very high. The losses usually not so significant that it will cause the board to pull the ripcord and all of a sudden sell out of the portfolio if there is more market turmoil ahead. But doesn't mean we don't work with boards who are willing to take on a little bit more fluctuation and live with it. And then, yeah, this might be a good time to lean into the down market to invest a little bit more.
Thanks, Chris. Good question, Jim. Any last thoughts or questions? Cheryl asked, are you seeing any increases in banks closing?
Well, I mean, not since a couple of years ago, right? Where, periodically we run into these times of turmoil when all of a sudden there were some pretty well-known banks, First Republic Bank and Silicon Valley Bank, that really ran into trouble because they take in deposits and then lend those out to other borrowers, where all of a sudden there was a claim on their deposits, but they didn't necessarily have all of those on hand. Sort of the good old-fashioned run on the bank. I don't know that we're necessarily seeing or expecting a massive increase. But I will say this, it sort of raises another question in my mind, that a lot of organizations, they want to be mindful of the risk that they have in their banking relationship. And so sometimes they spread out their deposits or CDs among a number of banks, and they have $249,000 with a whole bunch of banks so that they get that FDIC insurance. I'll just point out that the work that we do, not everybody's familiar with the kind of insurance that applies to investment firms, brokerage firms, RIAs. It's called the SIPC insurance, the Securities Investors Protection Corporation. It's kind of the sister to FDIC. It has a little bit higher limit, $500,000 per account than the FDIC insurance. And firms are actually able to purchase supplemental insurance to those SIPC limits. And in fact, Bernstein buys $50 million worth of account to insure our clients against any sort of fraud or insolvency or any of those things that have not happened in our history, but are risks that you want to be mindful of. And by the way, Bernstein's business structure is not one to lend out deposits, but just to manage those funds as your agent. So there are ways to limit that risk, which was a very long answer to, while I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know that I see bank failure at this point on the horizon, but it is something I guess you want to make sure you're positioned for.
Thanks, Chris. And Cheryl, I saw the follow-up question of, do you see any changes being proposed to FDIC? And I'll let Chris add anything if he has thoughts, but I would say just extremely hard to predict things like that. But the trend that we do see, to Chris's point, are nonprofits just deciding to aggregate accounts with that higher SIPC insurance to sort of get that ease of use and peace of mind.
Yeah. I just have a question about definitions. Marie and I are on a few boards and have been on others that you hear the term fiduciary responsibility, and a lot of people are a little concerned about whether they're doing the right thing financially. And if you're talking about one of these reserve funds, the difference between a money market or a CD or some other form of fund with 30% stocks and bonds, whatever, where in your mind does it come? What is fiscally responsible?
Sure. Well, as a fiduciary, you have a few basic duties to be loyal to the organization and financially to try to invest the assets to best meet the mission of the organization. What you're not charged with doing is saying, invest these in a way that never loses a dollar for the organization. Instead, you have to create a diversified portfolio. All of these, whether it's cash equivalents or a balance of stocks and bonds, would be well diversified. And you do have to think about a number of factors. So the mission of the organization, the intent of the donor, the time horizon of the potential investment and the need, the impact of inflation or deflation, economic circumstances. So I would say that, again, funds that might be there to support the organization into perpetuity, it's probably a risk to keep those invested entirely in cash equivalents, because over time you have very little chance to grow those assets on an inflation adjusted basis. So you're always sort of balancing these trade-offs. I think any of the investment type allocations or strategies we talked about today would be very prudent. There's nothing that would be outside or beyond the realm of your fiduciary duty. And the best thing you can do is really try to, again, match the time horizon of when you might need these funds versus the time horizon of how they're invested. If you know for sure that you're going to need these funds in October, well, then you don't want to invest them in a portfolio that's 70% stocks and 30% bonds, right? You're going to keep those in cash and collect your 4% interest until then. But if you're also not likely to touch more than, say, some of the annual earnings to support your operating budget on these funds for the very long term, those you probably don't want to keep in cash. You want to think about a more balanced investment strategy. So it's really, coming up with a balanced approach that's going to meet the time horizon of the need, and then documenting that in an investment policy statement for good governance, and you should be just fine.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Yeah, I was just gonna say, any last questions, or I think we're good. Okay, and as Chris said too, we have the contact information, for both Ben and Chris that will be that's on the slides and that we will share with you also. I want to thank Chris and Ben very much. This has been a great educational hour and a half for us, and it's not the easiest topic, I think, because you know, there's a certain amount of fear involved, but fortunately, you have experience with that and training and a very nice calming approach. So we appreciate it very much. And particularly your expertise. I should start there more than the calm approach. So so thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Just as a quick repeat, we will share the link to the recording for this webinar, as well as the slides that Chris and Ben referenced by the end of the week, which is tomorrow. So you'll have it very soon. And we thank you for joining us. And also in the notes, in the email, you'll see the link to the next session that we have in fundraising through challenging times, as well as a link to Fundraising Fridays, if that's something that you're interested in and haven't done before. So with that, thank you so much. Be well, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you guys so much.